Thank you for joining me. I'm Nola Simon. I'm the host of the Hope and Possibilities podcast. And today I actually wanted to talk a little bit about what's happening in the US and the world in general. But I wanted to share my unique perspective because some of you may not realize that I worked for a global organization in financial services for 17 and a half years. 16 of those years were actually based in the American division, and my clients happened to be for 8 years mostly in Minnesota. So everything that's been happening in the US recently has been focused on the state of Minnesota, and that's fascinating to me because a lot of what's been happening has been happening primarily where my clients were based. I've actually been to Minnesota more than any other area of the US because of that experience, except for Florida. Been to Florida a lot as a Canadian. That's Disney World, that's a thing for Canadians. But Minnesota, I've been through the entire state. I once did a whole week car trip through Minnesota. And so everything that's been happening is shocking, but quite honestly, not entirely shocking. I started leaving John Hancock when I was 2016. My father-in-law had died in 2015. We settled his estate finally in 2016. And then my mother was diagnosed with dementia and died in 2017. It took me another year and a half to actually leave. Car accident. Didn't help in 2018. It took a lot of time to really find that transition because it was like I had packed up and moved to the US for 16 years. I realized that the way that I told the story about my skills and abilities and how I talked about the work really didn't resonate in Canada. And even though I was always paid in Canada by a Canadian company, the work itself didn't resonate. And what I learned over the years too was I have the ability to work with people who don't share values and beliefs. I had a personal rule with my American clients. I didn't talk about gun control. I didn't talk about religion. I didn't talk about the medical system. And I didn't talk about employment law for the most part. You only have to have a couple of conversations about a year-long maternity leave to realize that the value system is just so significantly different, and the laws that are in place to support that are so fundamentally different from Canada that it's not in anybody's best interest really to highlight, especially when there's a mentality that the customer is always right and you really don't want to annoy them. So I did that for 16 years. And what happened in 2016? Funny you ask. Obamacare got disabled. And so when Obama was in the White House and there were significant changes to the medical system in particular, hardship withdrawals for medical bankruptcy really went down. And those calls were always hard to really take. In 2016, when that stopped, those calls started again. And I didn't want to subject myself to that anymore. Like, I could see what was happening and fundamentally what was going to happen because I studied history at university. My major was math, but I minored in history. And my father actually grew up in Nazi Germany. He was born in 1932, so when the war happened, he was 7 years old. My mother was from Glasgow. So my parents, since the time I was as a child, really educated me on the different aspects of politics and how that's woven into daily life and the choices individual people make when the world is hard, when society is presenting choices that aren't fundamentally in your best interest, nor are they things that you value, but how do you survive that? So it's been really fascinating to me. And so I identified 10 years ago that I wanted to reduce the amount of American exposure in my day-to-day life. And that was not where I wanted to really have my career centered. And from a Canadian perspective, I've really been removing American influence from my personal life and my career for 10 years. This is not just something that has started because of tariffs or anything like that. And I think Americans are really stunned that Canadians are finding it that easy to really divorce themselves from American culture and pop culture and the way that we shop, the choices that we make to buy elsewhere, and how that really is impacting the American economy. You're seeing the travel industry is being decimated because people are just choosing not to travel. And we're seeing states actually running advertising campaigns to get Canadian travelers back, despite the fact that it doesn't feel safe to actually cross the border because of ICE. Even just the threat really to look at your phone and your social media. I've been commenting on my reasons for leaving an American division for 10 years. I can't walk that back. At some point, somebody's going to look at things that I've said over 10 years that weren't controversial when I wrote them and think that they might be controversial now. So how do I proceed? My client base is not American. I'm definitely global in nature. I will look at what's happening in Australia and the UK and Denmark and Europe in general. And I definitely look at the US because I've got a great deal of familiarity with it. But quite honestly, my bread and butter would be, the ideal would be to have a solid Canadian base. It really doesn't harm me or impact me to really talk about the fact that Americans really need to own what's going on in their country. And I know the majority of Americans didn't vote for this. I know the majority of Americans didn't expect government agents to be shooting citizens in the streets. I talked to Americans for 16 years daily, multiple times a day. They're good people, the majority of them. They care, they're courteous, they're polite, they're interesting, they're funny. I miss quite a lot of them. Even 10 years later, I think about the people who made my days a daily delight because they were fun. So when I talk about Americans, it's with great deal of appreciation because I like a lot of the clients that I dealt with. But I also know that change only really happens when you own your collective impact. And so you may not have voted for what's happening, but you do have the ability to make a difference and advocate for change. And this is where this fight for democracy that's happening actually on the streets of Minneapolis and the protests and on Friday there's supposed to be no work, no school, no shopping, an economic boycott really to impact the companies that are not standing up for what's right and what's uncomfortable. That's nice to see because quite honestly, that's what Americans have to do. And it has to be Americans. That's where 10 years ago, when I made the decision that I wanted to work with people and companies whose values match mine, and the way to do that was to focus more on Canada and Canadian companies rather than American companies. I made that decision 10 years ago, and people are just noticing this now and confronting it, because it can't come from anybody who's external, because Americans themselves don't value the insight. And I'm going to pause there and just say, I'm not trying to be insulting with that. I'm not trying to be confronting with that. It's just a reality of the American personality, which is home of the brave, land of the free. Americans are the best. You see it in movies where the American flag comes in and the heroes are always Americans. I can't tell you how many times I've seen recreation of World War II where the Americans are the heroes, even though the whole rest of the world was present and contributed in multiple different ways as well too. The storytelling that is woven into day-to-day American life is that Americans are the good guys. And so when things are happening that are not in the best interest of sustaining that narrative, the change, the advocates, the people who have to really fight for this have to be Americans. Because you're the only voices that really make a difference to each individual American. And that matters. So I'm doing this in a podcast rather than actually writing it on LinkedIn, because I feel the need to share it. But I also know that I get fewer listeners. And so this is controversial. I realize that. I have a perspective that not a lot of Canadians are willing to speak up and say. My relationship with my American clients worked because I was not honestly allowed to voice my distinct Canadian opinion. Right? I was throttled. My calls were recorded. People knew what I was saying. And honestly, I probably conveyed a lot more than I ever should have to the majority of the clients that I had. But realistically, you never got the honest, upfront version of me without a corporate filter. So I really hope that Americans figure it out, because it's shocking to see the relationship between Canada and the US disintegrate the way it has. But Mark Carney is right. It's nostalgia. It's the way it used to be. And quite honestly, it's been disintegrating for far longer than what most people think. Again, I started seeing this and making moves to change my interactions 10 years ago. And what does that mean for the future? I don't know. I think it really depends on the way that individual Americans speak up and advocate for what they want the future to be. And I know that's scary, and I know that it doesn't feel safe, especially with the way that people are being shot and murdered. There's no easy answer, but the answers do have to come from Americans, because what's going to happen is other people, other countries are going to make choices that protect them, that make their daily lives feel safer. And quite honestly, I'm an example.